Up next, we're going to see a quick message from our summit partners, Emeritus. Emeritus makes world-class education accessible and affordable to individuals, companies, and governments around the world. Emeritus is present in several countries. They've partnered with over 75 universities, and they've touched over 300,000 students. Okay, with that, let's move on to our next panel. So our next panel is Out of India, Exporting Education to the World. I don't know if all of you have heard this stat that India has 5 million software engineers, and this is expected to very quickly grow to 10 million in the next 5 years. And the software industry is an oasis of high productivity. The 0.8% of workers that work in that industry generate 8% of our GDP. So it's no wonder that we've become an exporter of software and technology. Startups around PreK to Gray are now exporting education from India to the world. And here to discuss strategies on how to build their companies into great global companies are our next group of panelists. So please help me welcome up Charag, Krishnan, partner McKinsey & Company, who will lead this discussion. Pranjal Kumar, CFO at Emeritus. Ravi Bhushan, founder and CEO at BrightCHAMPS. Pramath Sinha, founder and chairman of the Board of Trustees, Harappa Education, and founder and chairman of Ashoka University. And Mohan Lakhamraju, CEO of Great Learning.
Good morning, and welcome everyone to day 3 of this fantastic gathering. We've spent the past couple of days talking a lot about the opportunity for education in India and for this community. I think we want to spend the next 30 minutes or so focusing on the sliver of that opportunity, which is about serving students abroad and bringing education to the world from India. Fantastic illustrious group we have here representing the spectrum, B2C companies, B2B players, serving all the way from K-12 to higher education to adult learners. So in the spirit of that conversation, I'd love to focus on one stat to begin with. It is expected that this year, India is going to overtake China as the largest exporter of students to universities in the US. Which brings the question of how big is that opportunity? How much growth do we expect in terms of serving students abroad? And so I'd love to start the conversation there with you, Ravi. If you could talk a little bit about BrightCHAMPS and the growth it has experienced over the past couple of years, and how do you think about that growth in serving students abroad?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. I think the global opportunity which is there, Anita mentioned about ITIT success, right? The kind of success we have demonstrated from India, serving the global requirements. A very similar sort of opportunity exists in the education field also. And BrightCHAMPS as a company, we have started with the global aspiration from day one. We have started from Middle East, and then we went to Southeast Asia, and then we are serving North America also. I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is, more than political boundaries of the countries, right? What is important is that, what is the, as far as the EdTech online is concerned, serving is more premised around what is the cultural and language, division in the globe. So there are two sets of opportunity. One is that India serving to the English-speaking population. And the second is Indian platform serving to the other regions wherein the supply can be, global supply can serve the global demand, right? BrightCHAMPS entered into the first option to start with. And then we entered into those markets wherein language was also a barrier. And then we found that many of the countries like in Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia, Vietnam, Saudi Arabia and Middle East, all these countries, large portion of the market is unlocked or underserved because of the language barrier, right? So there is a big opportunity in option 2, which is if you can create a global supply serving to the global demand, there also a big opportunity, and countries like Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia, all these are like very fertile ground wherein education can be penetrated. And all these countries are growing very, very fast. I was sort of going through the macro factors and realized that, in most of this country, government spending, as far as the total expenditure of the government on education is more than 20%.
Fantastic.
So the growth is phenomenal, and the expected growth rate is more than 20%, which is very, very fertile and good.
Amazing. Could I bring it and build off of that, so sort of we hear a little bit from the K-12 perspective? If I bring it to you, Mohan, how would you talk about great learning and what you've experienced in terms of your growth to over 180 countries?
Yeah. So we went international almost by pull. We were operating largely in India till about 2018, and we found that there were people joining our programs from near shore, whether it is Middle East, Southeast Asia, and then we saw that there were people of Indian origin joining from the United States and doing things at night time, their time. So we said, let's make it easier for them, and then we started officially offering it in the US and in other markets as well. And surprisingly, we thought that many things would be very different, but turns out that surprisingly, the needs of adult learners, there's more in common than different across geographies. So as long as we adjust for those differences, we find that we are able to serve them very well from India. One of the kind of examples of that was our initial premise was folks in the US are very used to self-service. So they don't really need the hand-holding that learners in India appreciate and value so much. Yep. But when we offered them, we found out that not only do they appreciate it a lot, they highly valued it. Yep. So when we, at the end of our programs, ask the question, what did you like most about the program? Almost universally, it is that support and hand-holding that we provide. So what we found is that learning needs and user characteristics are very similar, at least in our segment. This is adult learner segment. And so that positions us very well to be able to serve. So for those of you that may not be familiar, so we help working professionals upskill. So help them learn digital skills across technology, across data sciences and AI, across business and management and so forth. And so this is some people that have reached a certain stage of their career, building new skills to get to the next stage of their career. So that's what we do. And so we offer that on our platform to about 10 million learners across 170 different countries. And so we have paid learners from about 90 countries, and the rest are taking up our free programs. So that's kind of the space that we are in.
No, thank you for that, Mohan. I want to spend some more time on the differences and similarities, but sort of still a little bit on the topic of growth. Pranjal, when we were preparing and talking about this ahead of the panel, you talked about growth not just in terms of US and UK. So how do you think about that geographically in terms of the scale and the growth opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we are at a very unique, advantageous position. If you look at, players like us or Great Learning or, even BrightCHAMPS, et cetera, in terms of the fact that if you look at our cost structure and if you look at our business models, they are attuned to serve a frugal customer in India, right? And when you export that, then you can actually disrupt the market when it comes to LATAM, when it comes to Africa, when it comes to Southeast Asia. About 70% of our, for example, revenue comes outside of US and Europe, right? And if you look at, for example, players like Coursera, et cetera, 50% of that is coming from US and Europe. I mean, edX has a huge traffic in India, but they are not monetizing. So that tells you the fact that, look, if you look at our business model and cost structure, we are at a very advantageous position vis-a-vis some of the other global players. And I would sort of provocatively say this, that look, you fast forward a decade from now, you would find a lot more EdTech MNCs emanating out of India versus what you see otherwise 20 years back, like how Nandan mentioned yesterday. There are three trends, if I will just sort of taste, right? I mean, if you take the parallel that Ravi mentioned about ITES 20 years back, I think at that time, the arbitrage was primarily cost and quality. Right? I think we're also at a unique position where there's also an arbitrage of data, like Nandan mentioned yesterday, right? So I think the kind of data that is being generated by learners in India in these geographies is much higher. There are regulatory reasons for it. I mean, data privacy laws, of course, we all know how they are in the US and Europe versus in other geographies and all of that, right? So we are again at an advantageous position, not just from a cost and quality arbitrage, but also from a data arbitrage, right? I'll give another example, right? WhatsApp. If you look at WhatsApp as a tool to service customers, we found extremely, WhatsApp is the preferred channel in India. It's, by the way, the preferred channel in LATAM. And you ask in US, I'm sure WhatsApp is not the channel. The US people still text, right? They don't WhatsApp. So that tells you that, the tools that we are building, which are for India, based on Indian consumption and data, is relevant for markets outside of US and Europe, and will soon disrupt the market in the US, like Mohan mentioned, because, even the US learners want that hand-holding, they want that kind of support, and I think that's a huge advantage for us.
Very helpful. Let me go to you, Pramath, and another cut of this growth opportunity. You talked about not the usual suspects, and there's an opportunity in some of the lesser-known organizations and places where institutions are looking to partner. Could you say more about that as Harappa makes its foray into serving students abroad?
Yeah, just to build on what others have said. But before that, I just want to congratulate the GSV team and Deborah and Anita and others for having pulled this off. I think this is an incredible conference. And I'm not saying this just to flatter them because they are here, but in my earlier avatar, I used to organize education conferences, and it's a tough nut at this. It's a tough group of people to get together in India, but over the last few days, there's been a complete buzz everywhere about this conference. So congratulations. But coming back to, because we have limited time, I'd like to make 3 quick points. I do think that there is a significant disruption that we are seeing, almost reminiscent of what I saw in my earlier years as with what happened with IT. I did some of the landmark work that NASSCOM did in the early days to scope out the opportunity. And I see a lot of similarity. And you all have been talking about it. We are all conscious of it. But I think that scale of that opportunity is quite massive. And I don't think, I've only realized that recently. I'm a recent entrant of taking an Indian entity into the US. But I see a lot of similarities in terms of just the factor cost advantage. And it's a sustainable for the next decades, I think. So I think that's very exciting. And I think as we build businesses, and that's where some of the unusual suspects have a shot at it, right? I mean, if you think about it, I met a young woman the other day, and she said that her husband and she worked at a multinational. And I said, which multinationals do you work in? And they said, Infosys and Wipro. Now, 25 years ago, these were the unsuspecting guys on the block. And today, people think of them as not Indian companies, but multinational companies. So I think that's the scale of opportunity that we're talking about. And it's manifest in pricing, which even for a small company like ours, we see 4 or 5 times of exactly the program that we offer here. Marginal increase in costs because you have to take care a little bit of local faculty, local coaches, but the servicing can all be done high quality, high touch out of India. So that I think is the first thing I'm noticing. And so it does give a chance for unusual suspects to make a go for it. Pretty much all of us are unusual suspects. The big education firms are actually not around. I think the second interesting thing is that I find that the opportunity, at least in the US, and we are still early, we are more B2B in the US. The hyper-local opportunity is very interesting. So, for example, in upstate Wisconsin, partnering with a community college to cater to small and medium businesses that are there in the local county is a real opportunity. You wouldn't think of doing that here in India. but I think in those more advanced environments you can do. The last thing I will say is that I was listening closely to Mohan. I think as people I've been surprised at the acceptance of a pure Indian product. Honestly, I was a little bit perhaps biased against our own quality. I wasn't sure if we really could match the expectations. But we haven't run into that at all with regard to perception about Indian quality being lower quality or worrying about accents or case studies and stuff like that. In fact, I think as people are watching Korean shows and Turkish shows on TV, there's almost an exotic element to learning from India. But I will say that there is still an expectation of high quality. And I've always said that quality doesn't scale in education, even with the offline institutions I've built. And so it is very important for all of us as an industry to not fool around with doing gimmicky stuff, because we hurt each other. The big reason the IT industry took off is because NASSCOM came in as a very strong driver to make sure that there was rational behavior across the board, and people stood up against the risks of losing the game. I think we have to really focus on high quality from day one if we have to build the Indian education brand, not our individual brands. So those are the points I wanted to make.
Thank you, Pramath. Let me go to you, Vivek, and you talk a little bit about universal things that you can bring to the world. Could you share a little bit more about how you think about that at QLearn and how math learning is taken off?
Sure, Charag. So what we do is essentially take K to 12 maths education to the world. This is after-school product. And there's some interesting parallels with sort of China becoming the export factory of the world for goods, but some interesting fundamental differences. And I wanted to sort of reflect on that, much on what Pramath's talking about. If you start by saying you're going to deliver a cost arbitrage only and the quality is sort of iffy, you're doomed. So if you basically have the confidence that what you're teaching is both the actual method of teaching as well as the content is world-class, and price it that way and deliver a quality and not compromise, then you'll scale. So it's a bit of a funny one where, like the Japanese took their cars first into the US, or the Chinese took the manufactured good into the US, which was sort of a win from bottom. That's not the approach that would work for us. I think education is fundamentally different. And we've had the same misgivings about whether the American population would accept our prices and so on and so forth. So we actually sold ourselves very cheap. And that basically gives a very poor signal, right? If you're selling yourself cheaper than what market thinks is good quality, just because you can afford to, because you have a low cost structure, you're doomed. So we did a fundamental reset last year, and we said, look, first, what are US parents telling us? They're telling us that you're really, really good quality. And what's the proof of that? Well, they retain. We had over 80% retention in the US. So that's a very high number. And so we said, let's speak to the parents and understand what the alternatives are. And the alternatives are pretty dire for them. They don't have access to good quality teachers, especially in the state schools. And if they do private education for one-to-one coaching, it's $40, $50, $60 an hour. And we're like, hang on, why are we choosing to ask for $10 an hour just because we can afford to? So we bumped it up to 20. I mean, there aren't that many consumer companies out there that will bump it up to 20 and see an increase in revenue. Right? Usually you have a price elasticity curve that says you take up prices, volume would fall. So this is one of those things where I think we need to think differently. I wanted to reflect on the point on quality very strongly, that if you have very high quality and make sure you don't drop the bar, you can price well, and you don't sell then a price arbitrage product, but actually a high quality product that happens to be profitable because you have a price advantage, not the other way around.
Let me build on a couple of threads that are beginning to come together around reputation, around quality, and being able to deliver high quality at low scale. Pranjal, you talked about brand as being something really critical and difficult, however, to build. So how do you think about the pricing, the quality points, as well as the brand building challenges?
Yeah, I think we discussed that prior to the panel, right? And I think if I again zoom out in the B2C world, and then we can come to the B2B, as Pramath mentioned, that's an interesting channel as well. I think on the B2C side, it's very clear if you have to build a global business, you have to have a global brand. And different companies have taken different routes to that. I think at Emeritus, we have always believed that an education brand cannot be built in a decade, but in centuries. I mean, you look at education brands globally, you know what I'm talking about. And hence, it's better to partner with a established brand, leverage that, versus building an own brand, right? And of course, institutions like ISB, etc., have accelerated that process very quickly. But in general, you would see that it takes a lot of time. Our thesis here is that if you're building a global brand, you're better off actually partnering with institutions. Number two is education also at some level is local. Think about any media company, for example, right? When they have grown and become global, they've also felt that, look, you're better off partnering or acquiring local companies. And that's what education is, because at the end of the day, if you look at, let's say, a frontline worker in a Starbucks, let's say in Florida, a barista there, she would be more keen to take a program from University of Miami versus MIT. Two reasons. One is locally, that's what is more popular and recognized. Number two is the fact that, how the individual herself believes about her confidence, where she can fit in, etc. So, and hence, if you're having a singular brand globally, it's very tough. Because how do you communicate to a working executive who is 20 years in the system, aspiring to be a CXO, and wants to do a high-quality Harvard program, but that lady in barista in Starbucks wanted to do a Miami program? So our thesis here is partner with institutions globally, get your brands right, leverage that, and then become global. It also accelerates the process because of the heterogeneity of the market and the localization of the market. Yeah.
Very interesting. I would love to go to you, Ravi, to hear a little bit about what it has been like to build a brand from scratch midst of the pandemic. But before we go there, just Pramath, your thoughts on a very contrasting approach to what Pramath has, what Pranjal just shared about Emeritus versus what Harappa is doing.
Sure, and I do think they are contrasting approaches, and I think that's the beauty of this. The opportunity is so big that you will see different models emerge. I do believe, though, that the Emeritus brand itself, you may have used the partnership, but it's a very strong brand in itself now. And I think that'll give you the license to do your own programs one day. I think you will be seen as an MNC one day, as I was giving the example. By contrast, I've taken the approach of saying, listen, we want to build the brand, we want to build the institution, we want the institution to be known for its content and programs. It's a harder nut to crack. But part of it is a little bit of jingoism and nationalism, if you will, to say, listen, can we build a true education brand out of India? If we are worth our salt, we should be able to do that. So I think that you'll see multiple models emerge, but I think these are all part of exporting or building educational brands out of India, and I think there'll be multiple pathways.
Ravi, would you mind sharing a little bit about
of course,
what it was like to start a company in July of 2020?
Yeah. We started in the peak of pandemic, and we started with a global aspiration, right? And I was knowing that I'm venturing into something wherein there is so much of diversity across different countries, so many different culture. The expectation of the customer or user will be very, very different. But I think there are some things which are very fundamental. And as far as the brand building exercise in education is concerned, the first and foremost thing is that, you have to build a trust with the society, right? And that trust starts, in our case, with the parent and then with the student. People talked about, the quality of service and quality of teachers, right? That's very important. That's like a important hygiene. But beyond that, I think you also need to understand the fact that, building a brand in education is also about, are you playing with a position of a strength or position of begging, right? So many of the EdTech companies I find, right, and to some extent, many of us are victim of that. So we go to the market and we promise and, we start begging to the parent that. But then most of the high quality brands which exist in education, they play from position of a strength, right? And they say that, you should feel proud to get associated with us. So there are a couple of things which we did. One is we didn't chase more than required, right? So we said that, if I am the parent, I have a child, I would love to spend my money on my child education, right? Then if the parent is standing in the market with the dollar in his hand, why are you unnecessarily trying to snatch more than required, right? So don't be impatient about it, right? Number one. Number two, think about learning outcome. Focus on the quality of teachers, right? It's a slow cooking process. It takes time because when you have different batches of learning outcome visible in the society, then people start accepting you, right? But most important thing is that work on the long-term project of building the trust with the society, work with a position of a strength, and then focus on the fact that the service which you are providing, there is a minimum quality standard maintained, right? But apart from all these things, I also must mention that the same sort of revenue can bring in different types of expectation in different market, right? People paying $10 for a class in Southeast Asia and people paying $10 in US, right? They will have different expectation, right? So you have to choose your market that, how much quality you can afford, right? It's, of course, everybody wants to provide top notch, but, affordability is also an angle, right? So choosing the market carefully and making sure that, you're working on a long-term trust building project, I think are the main ingredient.
Fantastic. So it's great to hear a little bit about the approach, the avoiding gimmicks. There's another important ingredient that we heard quite a bit about yesterday as well, and on the back of the NEP, which is regulation. I'd love to hear from you, Mohan. When we talked about it, you thought about growth opportunities with a lens of where regulatory environment is also supportive. On one end of the spectrum, you have China and the crackdown on EdTech. How do you think about regulation in the context of where you pursue growth opportunities?
So higher education generally, globally, is quite regulated. So now we straddle between professional learning / upskilling and higher education. So in India, we are in higher education, which is regulated, so we follow all the regulations and there is a fairly strict regulatory regime that is out there, so we follow that. Internationally, we are staying out of the regulated space. So far, we have not entered into the regulatory space outside, and something we may do in the future, but so far we've stayed away from that, so we don't depend on any government funding or any federal loans or any of that, so we've stayed out of that because I think it comes with its own set of challenges, and we find that the growth opportunity for us outside of that is still a long way to go before we get into those territories. Just one thing I wanted to add, in relation to a previous point, like why do we actually even have a rite of passage? Why are we even able to, right? So one of the things that hasn't come up so far is that a common thread across all the things that we are all doing is that the content or the learning that we are imparting is the same globally. So whether it is math, whether it is, let's say, digital skills, data science, coding, all of those things, one, it is the same everywhere. The technologies, the skills, they're the same everywhere. And two, the Indian market is an extremely demanding market, right? So being able to serve customers here and deliver those outcomes actually prepares us very well, to do that in other geographies, right? So I thought that was something that didn't come up in the earlier thing that I wanted to mention as well. I already answered the regulatory part.
Helpful. Vivek, you talked a lot about regulation in the context of accountability. Would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I mean, so the K-12 after-school tutoring market is not that regulated in most parts of the world, so we don't necessarily suffer from regulation per se. And this is why it becomes even more imperative for us to self-regulate, because if you don't self-regulate, the market will basically kill you. And that's the key. The key is to essentially think about to always maintain a high bar. I want to bring it back to what Pramath talked about. If you don't, in a regulated market, it's easy to have a minimum bar that the market has established. In a so-called unregulated market, the consumer decides what is acceptable and what is not. So we have actually had to create our own internal sort of standards and regulations of both the actual pedagogy and everything we do regarding that, but even more importantly, what we do regarding the go-to-market and the way to sell. Because a lot of the noise around K-12 education is around what we are doing in terms of the way to sell, the go-to-market. So we have pretty strict standards out there on what salesmen can and cannot do, what marketing messages can and cannot be given. So, and the point here is that the marketing people say that we are not worried about, the salespeople and the marketing people say we are more worried about whether you'll allow us to say this thing which is edgy than about any regulation. Because we are essentially saying if we don't have a high bar and create a bad brand out there, then it's impossible to retrieve. And sometimes that brand will associate itself with brand India as well. And this is one of the things, right? For most of the US markets, international markets, if you say you're a math tutoring company from India, in general, they are positive. I mean, they have some trouble with very heavily accented English, but if you're neutral accented, you're fine. You're actually welcomed as high bar. And that's a good thing that, so, I mean, I don't like stereotypes in general, but this is a good stereotype to have. But if you then go and screw it up, then it's sort of game over for not just the company, but for the brand India that essentially is exporting. So I do think it's important, just like the way the Koreans did or the Japanese did about the nature of the country's brand and what it does. I mean, Germany does it best for manufacturing. Therefore, it's important that we basically put in. So we've actually dropped a lot of bad quality revenue or revenue which was based on sales that we wouldn't have done in the past. And because we've said from there we can build out a high bar system which basically leads to high retention and then therefore builds the flywheel of brand. So we are not regulated, but we are regulated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I would like to add here, there is a difference between, so given that we are in education, even if it's regulated, like Vivek said that, the sector in which we are, it's not highly regulated, right? That doesn't mean that, so regulation will eradicate out or eliminate out the bad elements, right? But that is not a sufficient criteria to be successful. There's a difference between being legally right and ethically right, right? So even if you are tick marking all the check boxes of regulation, that doesn't mean that, it's sufficient, right? So being in education, you should be ethically right rather than legally right.
I know we're running close to time. One final question on the point of regulation, and Pramath also probably building on your prior experiences at ISB, at Ashoka. How do you think about the NEP allowing and opening up more opportunities for universities abroad, and how that will have sort of an effect on the growth opportunities in this?
NEP opening up?
For universities abroad.
To come here?
To come here.
Yeah, I think the NEP sort of broadly talks about it, but there are two specific legislations. One is the Gift City legislation, which allows you to offer programs. I think that's very attractive for universities that want to offer programs in India, because it truly allows you to operate as if you're in a foreign territory. And I happen to be on the committee to approve those universities, and they are serious, so it's actually happening. I'm a bit circumspect about universities opening campuses in India. I think we have this dream that universities are like corporations and they are looking to expand. I don't see that happening. But to the extent that a few of them will want to, these regulations are still to be made. It'll take a couple of years. But I think the Gift City opportunity is a very promising one. And several people, I think, are going to come in and start offering courses there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for your time and your insights. Wish you all the best of luck, and it'll be really energizing and powerful to see what we see and what we talk about in terms of the opportunity to serve students abroad at the GSV India Summit 5 years from now. Thank you all. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to our great panelists. Thank you.